Welcome to Life Stories, where we share tales of courage, resilience, and the triumph of the human spirit. Today, we bring you the story of Elizabeth Walker, a compassionate nurse who found herself framed for a crime she didn't commit, betrayed by those she trusted. Her fight for justice against a powerful conspiracy will leave you inspired by the power of truth and perseverance. It's a journey filled with heartbreak, hope, and the unwavering determination to uncover the light in the darkest moments. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories and join us as we begin today's unforgettable tale. My name is Jake Weston, and this is a story of betrayal, resilience, and redemption. I was once a detective, driven by a sense of justice that could not be dimmed by the grime of the streets or the bureaucracy of my department. But what I thought I knew about justice, and about myself, would be tested in ways I could never have imagined. This story begins in Charleston, South Carolina, a place where old money mingles with modern ambition, and where facades often hide shadows darker than the night. Elizabeth Parker was a nurse, kind, diligent, and utterly devoted to her patients. She had no family of her own but poured her heart into caring for others. Her latest patient was Mrs. Margaret Foster, a wealthy widow in her late 70s. Mrs. Foster lived in a sprawling estate on the outskirts of Charleston, a grand home that spoke of generations of privilege. But behind those walls, the atmosphere was anything but grand. Elizabeth's first day at the estate had left an impression she couldn't shake. Mrs. Foster's daughter, Victoria, had greeted her with the kind of smile that felt as sharp as broken glass. Victoria was beautiful, poised, and wealthy, but something in her eyes spoke of calculation, not kindness. "You'll find my mother difficult," she had said, her voice dripping with insincerity. "She's old, set in her ways, but I trust you'll manage. After all, it's what you're paid to do." Elizabeth had nodded politely, though the words stung. She didn't care for money or status. What drove her was the belief that everyone deserved dignity and compassion, especially in their final years. And so, she had stepped into Mrs. Foster's room with a calm determination, ready to do what she did best. What Elizabeth hadn't expected was the bond that would form between her and Mrs. Foster. Beneath the frailty and age, Margaret was sharp, witty, and deeply aware of the world around her. She told stories of her youth, tales of ballroom dances and summers by the sea, her voice tinged with nostalgia. Elizabeth found herself listening, not out of obligation, but because she enjoyed it. "You remind me of myself when I was young," Margaret once said, her wrinkled hand clutching Elizabeth's. "Strong, unyielding. Don't let this world change you." But something in Mrs. Foster's life didn't sit right with Elizabeth. Victoria rarely visited her mother unless it was to discuss financial matters. On one occasion, Elizabeth had overheard an argument between the two women. It was about money. Victoria insisted her mother update her will. Mrs. Foster, however, had resisted, her voice steady despite her weakened state. "Not while I still draw breath, Victoria. My estate will go where I decide." Elizabeth hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the tension in the house had a way of drawing her in. And then there was the man, the mysterious Dr. Michael Sanders, Mrs. Foster's newly assigned physician. He came often, too often for Elizabeth's liking, and his presence set her on edge. There was something unsettling about the way he moved through the house, as if he owned it, and the way Victoria seemed to defer to him. Elizabeth began to notice small changes, medications that didn't look quite right, schedules that didn't align with standard procedures. One night, as Elizabeth made her rounds, she heard voices in the hallway. She recognized Victoria's sharp tone and another voice, deep and authoritative, peering through a small crack in the door. She could just make out their silhouettes. "It needs to happen soon," the man said. "Everything is in place," Victoria replied in a whisper. But the words were clear. "I've waited long enough. My mother's stubbornness has cost me too much already." Elizabeth's stomach churned. Something was terribly wrong. The following morning, she double-checked the medications and discovered that one of the bottles had been tampered with. The pills were slightly different in color and size. Her hands trembled as she held the bottle, the weight of what she suspected pressing down on her chest. When she tried to confront Victoria about the medications, she was met with a cold, dismissive stare. "Are you accusing me of something? Nurse Parker, I suggest you focus on your duties and leave the rest to those who know better." Elizabeth was left feeling helpless. But her instincts told her she couldn't ignore what she had seen. She began keeping a journal, documenting every odd occurrence, every overheard conversation, every suspicion. She didn't know whom she could trust, but she knew she needed to protect Mrs. Foster. And then, the unthinkable happened. One evening, Mrs. Foster fell gravely ill. Elizabeth stayed by her side, administering care and praying silently for her recovery. But Margaret Foster passed away in the early hours of the morning. The grief was overwhelming, but it was nothing compared to what came next. The police arrived that same morning, led by a detective named Carter. Within hours, Elizabeth was accused of murder. The medications she had been so careful to monitor were now evidence against her. Victoria and Dr. Sanders stood as witnesses, painting a damning picture of a nurse consumed by greed, eager to claim her share of an inheritance. "I trusted her," Victoria had said, her voice laced with feigned sorrow. "But I see now that she was manipulating us all along." Elizabeth couldn't believe what was happening. She pleaded her innocence, tried to explain what she had seen, but her words fell on deaf ears. The trial was swift. The evidence, fabricated as it was, stacked against her. Prosecutor Anthony Johnson painted her as a cold-blooded killer, while Judge Carter dismissed her defense with barely concealed disdain. "Elizabeth Parker," the judge had said, his voice echoing in the courtroom, "you are hereby sentenced to death by electric chair." As the sentence was pronounced, Elizabeth's world crumbled. She was escorted from the courtroom in shackles, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she had been framed. But even as despair threatened to consume her, she clung to one thought: she had to find a way to prove the truth, to honor Mrs. Foster's memory and expose those who had stolen not just a life, but her own humanity. "I didn't know Elizabeth then, but her story would soon intersect with mine in ways neither of us could have foreseen. At the time, I was a man on the edge, my own life shattered by mistakes I couldn't undo. But fate has a way of bringing the broken pieces together. And sometimes, the pursuit of justice is enough to mend even the most fractured souls. Prison is a place where time slows, where the days stretch into eternity, and where every corner holds the weight of unspoken suffering." For Elizabeth Parker, the walls of the Charleston Women's Correctional Facility felt more like a tomb than a temporary holding place. She had always believed in the goodness of people, in the possibility of redemption. But here, amidst concrete and steel, that belief was tested every single day. Her first week in prison was a whirlwind of humiliation and fear. The guards, who were supposed to maintain order, barely hid their disdain. The inmates, hardened by years of survival, quickly labeled her as the granny killer. Whispers followed her through the corridors, growing louder with each passing day until they turned into jeers. One morning, while standing in line for breakfast, a towering woman with a scar across her cheek leaned in close and snarled, "I had a grandma. You know, if she was still alive, I'd make sure you'd never see daylight again." The words cut deep, not because they frightened Elizabeth, but because of the hopelessness they carried. How could she prove her innocence when even her fellow inmates saw her as a monster? The days settled into a cruel rhythm. Elizabeth would rise early, her thin mattress offering little rest, and try to blend into the background. She avoided confrontations, kept her head down, and spent most of her free time in the small library, a quiet refuge from the chaos of the yard. But even there, the stares followed her, sharp and unrelenting. Night was the hardest. It was when the memories came rushing back, the courtroom. The cold, detached voices of Victoria and Dr. Sanders. And the look on Mrs. Foster's face in her final moments. Elizabeth would lie awake, staring at the cracked ceiling, replaying every detail in her mind, searching for something she might have missed. Her cellmate, a wiry woman named May who was serving time for petty theft, occasionally tried to strike up conversation. May was an odd mix of street-smart toughness and surprising empathy, often sharing stories of her life outside and the family she had left behind. "Why don't you ever fight back?" May asked one night, her voice a mix of curiosity and frustration. "You just let them treat you like dirt." Elizabeth turned to her, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. "Because fighting doesn't prove anything. I didn't do what they said I did. And no amount of yelling or hitting will change their minds. The only thing that will is the truth." May nodded slowly, though her skepticism was clear. "You're a strange one, Parker. Most people in here would have snapped by now. Despite the harsh environment, there were moments of humanity, small acts that kept Elizabeth's spirit from breaking entirely. One day in the yard, she noticed an older inmate struggling to carry a bucket of water to the communal garden. Without hesitation, Elizabeth stepped in, her nurse's instincts overriding her own fears. "Let me help you," she said gently, taking the bucket. The older woman hesitated, her face lined with suspicion, but eventually nodded. As Elizabeth worked beside her, tending to the wilting plants, she felt a flicker of normalcy. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind her of who she was: a caregiver, a healer, someone who believed in the value of kindness. But the kindness was fleeting, and the cruelty returned with unrelenting force. A week later, Elizabeth found herself cornered in the showers by 3 inmates. Their leader, a woman with piercing green eyes, stepped forward, her voice dripping with malice. "You think you're better than us? Walking around like some innocent saint." She shoved Elizabeth against the wall, the cold tiles biting into her skin. "Let me remind you, nurse, this isn't your little hospital. This is hell. And we don't like liars." The first blow landed hard, a sharp jab to her stomach that left her gasping for air. But Elizabeth didn't fight back. She simply curled into herself, shielding her head as best as she could. When the guards finally arrived, it was too late. The bruises were already forming, and the humiliation was complete. In the infirmary, the doctor barely glanced at her injuries before muttering, "Killers don't deserve sympathy." The words stung more than the cuts and bruises. But Elizabeth refused to cry. Not there. Not in front of them. She saved her tears for the solitude of her cell, where she clutched a torn photograph of her mother, the only possession she had left. "Mom," she whispered into the darkness, her voice trembling. "You always told me to be strong. But I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I have it in me." That night, she dreamt of Mrs. Foster. In the dream, the old woman was sitting by a window, her face lit by the soft glow of sunlight. "Don't give up, Elizabeth," she said, her voice steady and reassuring. "You know the truth. And the truth has a way of coming out. But only if you fight for it." Elizabeth woke with a start, her heart pounding. She wasn't sure if it was a message from beyond or just her subconscious playing tricks on her. But it didn't matter. The words had lit a small, flickering flame inside her, a reminder that she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for Mrs. Foster, for the truth, and for the hope that justice, no matter how delayed, would prevail. In that moment, Elizabeth made a promise to herself. She would survive, no matter what it took. And when the time came, she would prove her innocence and bring those who had wronged her to justice. It was a fragile hope, but it was all she had. If Elizabeth was determined to endure, Jackson Weston was equally driven to uncover the truth. At the time of Elizabeth's conviction, Jackson was a man in free fall, his once promising career as a detective tarnished by bad decisions and a penchant for defying authority. I remember the first time I heard of him, he was the kind of cop who couldn't leave a case unsolved. Even if it cost him everything. And it had. Fired from the Charleston Police Department after pursuing a high-profile case against orders. Jackson had retreated to a dimly lit apartment where his days blended into nights. The walls were lined with yellowed newspapers and half-empty whiskey bottles. A testament to his obsession with the cases he could never forget. But when he stumbled upon Elizabeth Parker's story in the papers, something changed. The headline read, "Granny Killer Sentenced to Death." Beneath it was a photograph of Elizabeth in court. Her face pale but resolute. There was something about her eyes. A quiet defiance that struck Jackson. He didn't see the face of a killer, he saw someone fighting against the odds. Someone who had been left to drown by a system that was supposed to protect her. Jackson began digging. At first, it was just a distraction. A way to occupy his restless mind. But the deeper he delved, the more inconsistencies he uncovered. Witnesses whose statements seemed rehearsed. Evidence that conveniently appeared at the 11th hour. And the unsettling presence of Dr. Michael Sanders, a man whose name appeared in more than one case involving sudden deaths of wealthy elderly individuals. Late one night, Jackson sat at his cluttered desk, poring over court transcripts and newspaper clippings. He traced connections, made notes, and pinned photographs to the wall. The pieces of the puzzle began to form a disturbing picture. In each case, there were sudden changes to the victim's will, mysterious alterations to medications, and a trail of money leading to offshore accounts. This isn't just a single murder, Jackson muttered to himself, his voice hoarse from hours of talking to no one. It's a pattern. A goddamn blueprint. But connecting the dots was one thing, proving them was another. Jackson knew he couldn't do it alone. Reluctantly, he reached out to Florence Bennett, his former partner and one of the few people who still believed in him. Florence was sharp, resourceful, and uncompromising, a perfect counterbalance to Jackson's impulsive nature. When Florence arrived at his apartment, she took one look at the chaos and let out a low whistle. "You've really gone off the deep end, haven't you? Just hear me out," Jackson said, gesturing to the wall covered in evidence. "This case, Elizabeth Parker, she didn't do it. I'm sure of it. But whoever did has been playing this game for years. And they're damn good at it." Florence leaned in, studying the timeline Jackson had meticulously created. "If you're right, this is bigger than just Elizabeth. But if we're going to take on a network like this, we need proof. Real proof. Not just suspicions." Over the next few weeks, Jackson and Florence worked tirelessly. They uncovered records of Dr. Sanders purchasing a private clinic shortly after Mrs. Foster's death, funded by unexplained deposits. They found that Judge Wallace, who had presided over Elizabeth's trial, had a history of dubious rulings in cases involving wealthy estates. And then there was Victoria Foster, who seemed to benefit from every tragedy that befell her family. As the evidence mounted, so did the risks. One evening, Jackson returned to his apartment to find his files ransacked. The photographs on his wall torn down. A note was left on his desk: "Some things are better left buried." "Looks like we're getting under someone's skin," Florence said when Jackson showed her the note. Her tone was light, but the worry in her eyes was unmistakable. "You sure you want to keep going?" Jackson's jaw tightened. "If they're trying to scare us, it means we're close. I'm not backing down." The threats escalated. A car followed Florence home one night, its headlights glaring in her rearview mirror. Jackson found himself tailed by men in suits, their presence a constant reminder that he was being watched. But the danger only fueled their determination. With each step, they uncovered more of the conspiracy's dark underbelly. They discovered a connection between Sanders and a string of unexplained deaths in a neighboring state, all involving wealthy individuals. They traced payments from an account linked to Victoria to a prison guard who had falsified evidence in another case. But time was running out. Elizabeth's execution date loomed closer, And they still lacked the smoking gun that could blow the case wide open. One evening, as they reviewed their findings, Jackson leaned back in his chair, his exhaustion evident. "We need something definitive," he said. "Something that ties all of this together." Florence tapped her pen against the table, deep in thought. "We know Sanders was at the Foster mansion that night. And Elizabeth mentioned overhearing a voice. Something about standard procedure. What if we can match that voice to someone?" Jackson's eyes lit up. A voice recording. If Elizabeth can identify it, it could be the key to unraveling everything. It was a long shot, but it was the best lead they had. Jackson and Florence doubled down on their efforts, searching for any recordings that might implicate Sanders or his accomplices. At the same time, Jackson prepared for the possibility of breaking into Victoria Foster's estate, risking everything to gather the evidence they so desperately needed. As the days slipped by, the stakes grew higher. Jackson knew that if they failed, an innocent woman would die. But he also knew that this fight wasn't just about Elizabeth, it was about confronting a system that allowed greed and corruption to flourish, no matter the cost. The tension hung heavy in the air as the deadline loomed. Elizabeth's execution was now less than a week away, and the weight of time pressed down on Jackson and Florence like a vice. Every lead they pursued felt like a race against the clock, every misstep a reminder of the stakes. But amidst the chaos, a crucial decision had to be made. They needed to infiltrate Victoria Foster's mansion. Late one evening, Jackson and Florence sat in her small, cluttered office, poring over maps and blueprints of the sprawling estate. The mansion was a fortress, protected by layers of security that would make even seasoned criminals think twice. But it was also the epicenter of the conspiracy, a place where secrets were kept and deals were made. "I've managed to hack into their external security cameras," Florence said, her fingers flying across her laptop's keyboard. "There's a 2-hour window during the morning shift change when the guards are less attentive. If you can blend in, you might have a chance." Jackson leaned back in his chair, studying the screen. "And what exactly am I blending in as? Their morning yoga instructor?" Florence smirked. "Gardener. Turns out Victoria just hired a replacement. I pulled some strings and got you on the list. You'll have to play the part. Though, that means no leather jackets or your usual charming demeanor." "I can be charming when I need to be," Jackson muttered, rubbing his temple. "This isn't just a job, Florence. If something goes wrong..." She cut him off. "I know. But we don't have a choice. We need hard evidence. Something indisputable. And that house is the key." The morning of the infiltration arrived with a dense fog rolling over the Charleston suburbs. Dressed in a pair of worn overalls and carrying a toolbox, Jackson approached the gates of the Foster mansion. The sprawling estate loomed ahead, its manicured gardens and grand facade exuding an air of untouchable wealth. A guard stationed at the entrance glanced at Jackson's credentials, a forged set provided by Florence, and waved him through without much interest. "First day. Huh. Good luck keeping those hedges neat. The lady of the house likes things perfect." Perfect. The word lingered in Jackson's mind as he made his way to the garden, blending seamlessly with the household staff. He moved with practiced ease, trimming bushes and pruning flowers, all while mapping the layout in his head. Every step was calculated, every glance carefully measured. Inside the mansion, Victoria Foster was hosting a meeting. Through the large windows overlooking the garden, Jackson caught glimpses of her, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, gesturing with the authority of someone who had never known failure. Beside her sat Dr. Michael Sanders, his expression cold and detached. Jackson's jaw tightened as he observed them. It was one thing to suspect their involvement, it was another to see them conspiring in real time. He needed to get inside that house. He needed to know what they were planning. At the stroke of 10 a.m., Florence's voice crackled through the earpiece hidden in Jackson's cap. "You're clear to move. The maid just went upstairs. And the dining room is empty. Head toward the back door." Jackson wiped his hands on a rag and casually made his way toward the mansion's rear entrance. The door, left ajar by a distracted staff member, allowed him to slip inside undetected. The cool air of the interior hit him like a wave, carrying with it the faint scent of polished wood and expensive cologne. Florence guided him through the maze-like corridors, her hacking skills providing a temporary loop in the internal cameras. First door on your right. That's Victoria's study. Be quick. Jackson entered the study. A room that seemed to embody wealth itself. A massive mahogany desk sat at the center, surrounded by shelves lined with leather-bound books. He moved quickly, searching through drawers and scanning documents with a small camera concealed in his jacket. Anything? Florence's voice was tight with urgency. Bank transfers. Jackson whispered, flipping through papers. Offshore accounts. Payments to someone named Santos. That name ring a bell? Santos. Florence repeated. He's a prison guard. Transferred to the Charleston facility 3 months ago, right before Elizabeth's trial. The puzzle pieces were falling into place. Victoria Foster had orchestrated everything, from Mrs. Foster's murder to Elizabeth's framing. And Santos was one of her pawns. Jackson's eyes landed on a folder marked Special Procedures. Inside, he found schedules for Elizabeth's execution, signed documents from Judge Wallace, and detailed notes about altering medications. He photographed every page, his heart pounding. A sound from the hallway froze him in place, footsteps, deliberate and unhurried. Heading straight for the study, Jackson quickly returned the documents to their original positions, his mind racing for an escape route. Jackson. Someone's coming. Florence's warning was sharp. He ducked behind a curtain just as the door opened. From his hiding spot, he saw Victoria enter, followed by Santos and Sanders. Their conversation was hushed but clear enough for Jackson to catch. The execution is set, Victoria said, her voice cold. We've tied up all the loose ends. After tomorrow, Elizabeth Parker will be nothing more than a bad memory. And the nurse? Santos asked, his tone indifferent. She's been dealt with. Victoria replied. Once she's gone, we'll move forward with the next target. Everything is proceeding as planned. Jackson clenched his fists, anger surging through him. They weren't just murderers, they were predators, preying on the vulnerable for profit. He waited until the trio left the room before slipping out the back door, his mind racing with what he had just heard. Back at the safe house, Jackson shared the recording with Florence. They're planning another murder, he said, his voice heavy with urgency. We have to stop them. And we have to save Elizabeth. Florence nodded, her expression resolute. We've got enough to blow this wide open. But we need to act fast. Tomorrow might be our only chance. As the sun set, casting long shadows over the city, Jackson and Florence prepared for the most critical day of their lives. Failure was not an option. The next day dawned with an oppressive sense of urgency. Elizabeth's execution was less than 24 hours away, and the weight of the conspiracy's magnitude bore down on Jackson and Florence. They had a mountain of evidence. But without the right timing and execution, it wouldn't matter. The network of corruption they were up against was well-oiled and ruthless, and it would take everything they had to bring it crashing down. In the safe house, Florence paced back and forth, her laptop open on the rickety table. She was tracing communications between Judge Wallace, Santos, and Dr. Sanders, trying to find a connection strong enough to dismantle their scheme in court. Jackson, meanwhile, reviewed their plans for infiltrating the prison. It was risky, borderline suicidal, but it was the only way to stop the execution in time. You're sure you want to do this? Florence asked, her voice tinged with worry. We've uncovered enough to expose them. But going into that prison could mean both of us ending up in a cell or worse. Jackson looked up, his jaw set in determination. We don't have a choice. If they execute Elizabeth, They'll erase the last living witness who can directly tie them to Mrs. Foster's murder. The evidence alone won't be enough without her testimony. Florence nodded reluctantly. I'll run interference from here. I've managed to patch into the prison's camera system. But it won't last long. The loop I've created will give you a small window to reach the execution chamber. Jackson double-checked his gear. His forged credentials as an inspector from the Department of Corrections had already gotten him through Victoria's mansion. Now, he was banking on the same disguise to gain entry to the prison. As Jackson approached the Charleston Correctional Facility, his stomach churned. The high, barbed wire fences loomed ominously, and the guards at the entrance eyed him with suspicion. He handed over his credentials, doing his best to exude confidence. Routine inspection, he said curtly, mimicking the tone of authority he'd perfected during his years as a detective. The guard studied the documents for a moment before waving him through. Jackson suppressed a sigh of relief as the heavy gates clanged shut behind him. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating, a mix of bureaucratic efficiency and underlying menace. He had to remind himself to breathe as he made his way toward the execution wing. Florence's voice crackled through his earpiece. You're inside. Cameras are looping. But you've got maybe 15 minutes before someone notices. Move fast. Jackson kept his pace brisk but unhurried, blending in with the other staff. He reached the maximum security wing and stopped in front of Elizabeth's cell. Through the small window, he could see her sitting on the edge of her cot, staring blankly at the wall. Her once steadfast demeanor was now worn down to exhaustion and despair. Elizabeth Parker, he said softly, rapping lightly on the bars. She turned slowly, her eyes dull and lifeless until recognition flickered. I'm Jackson Weston. I'm here to get you out of this. Elizabeth's brow furrowed, and for a moment, doubt crossed her face. I don't understand. What can you possibly do? They've already decided. The execution's happening tomorrow. Not if we can prove your innocence, Jackson replied. He moved closer, lowering his voice. You said you'd recognize the voice of the man who was in the mansion that night. The one who switched the medications. Is that true? Her eyes widened slightly. I'd never forget it. Deep, commanding, he said something about standard procedure. That voice is etched in my memory. Jackson nodded, relief washing over him. Good. Because that voice belongs to someone who's here today. We're going to expose him. Just then, the sound of approaching boots echoed down the corridor. Jackson straightened, his heart pounding. Florence's voice came through the earpiece. Urgent. Jackson. Santos is heading your way. You need to get out now. Before Jackson could respond, Officer Santos rounded the corner, his face a mask of suspicion. Inspector Flores, he said, his tone laced with thinly veiled hostility. I didn't realize we had company in this wing today. Jackson met Santos's gaze with practiced calm. Routine inspection, he said, gesturing to his clipboard. The warden asked for a full review of the execution procedures. Santos's lips twitched into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Funny. I didn't hear anything about that. Let me escort you to the warden's office to confirm. Jackson's mind raced. If he was taken to the warden, his cover would be blown. He couldn't afford to leave Elizabeth. Thinking quickly, he adjusted his stance. Exuding authority. I have strict orders to complete this inspection independently. Any deviation, and I'll be reporting directly to Judge Wallace. Now, if you'll excuse me. The mention of Judge Wallace gave Santos pause. The guard's expression hardened, but he stepped aside, his suspicion still evident. Jackson took the opportunity to move down the corridor, signaling discreetly to Elizabeth that he'd return. Florence, he whispered as soon as Santos was out of earshot. I need something definitive on Santos. He's on to me. I'm already digging. Florence replied. But you need to be careful. He's not just a pawn in this game, he's part of the inner circle. I've got records of his involvement in other cases, but nothing concrete enough to confront him. Jackson clenched his fists. Time was slipping away, and every second brought them closer to Elizabeth's execution. He knew they needed a final piece of irrefutable evidence, a recording. A confession. Something that would shatter the conspiracy and exonerate Elizabeth once and for all. As he made his way toward the execution chamber, Jackson felt the weight of the mission pressing down on him. Failure wasn't an option. For Elizabeth's sake and for every victim of the Foster conspiracy, he would see this through to the end. The oppressive atmosphere of the prison pressed harder as Jackson moved toward the heart of the execution wing. Every footstep seemed to echo like a countdown, reminding him of the limited time he had to stop an irreversible injustice. The air was thick with tension, and his mind raced with possible outcomes, most of them grim. Florence's voice crackled through his earpiece, her tone taut with urgency. Jackson. Santos isn't backing down. He's made calls, and they're double-checking your credentials. You've got 10 minutes at best before the whole place turns on you. Jackson didn't respond immediately, his eyes scanning the corridors for an opening. He wasn't just looking for a way out, he was searching for the key to unraveling the entire conspiracy. I need more time, he finally whispered, his voice low. We're close. Florence. If we don't crack this now, Elizabeth dies tomorrow. Then move fast, she replied. I'll keep monitoring from here. But once they figure out you're not who you say you are, it's over. Jackson reached the observation area adjacent to the execution chamber, where preparations for Elizabeth's final moments were already underway. Technicians calibrated the equipment with clinical precision, their faces devoid of emotion. Beyond the thick bulletproof glass, he saw Elizabeth sitting in a holding cell, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Even from a distance, the weight of her despair was evident. He couldn't fail her. The sound of approaching footsteps snapped him out of his thoughts. Santos and 2 other guards entered the observation area, their expressions grim. Jackson turned away, pretending to study the control panel. He needed a distraction, something that would buy him just enough time to gather the evidence he needed. Then he saw him, the executioner. A man with broad shoulders and a measured gait, his face partially obscured by a hood. Jackson's heart skipped a beat as the executioner gave orders to the technicians, his deep, authoritative voice resonating through the room. That voice. The same voice Elizabeth had described. The one she'd overheard on the night Mrs. Foster died. Florence. Jackson whispered, his pulse quickening. The executioner, it's him. It has to be. His voice matches the description perfectly. Are you sure? Florence's voice was sharp, her fingers likely flying across her keyboard to pull up any relevant information. Positive. He's the one who switched the medications. Jackson replied. But I need proof. The executioner moved toward the lever that controlled the electric chair, his demeanor calm and deliberate. It was as if he'd done this countless times before. Jackson's stomach churned at the thought. The room grew quieter as Santos stepped closer to Jackson, his eyes narrowing. Inspector, Santos said, his tone mocking. You seem awfully interested in this operation. Care to explain why? Jackson turned slowly, meeting Santos's gaze with feigned confidence. It's my job to ensure procedures are followed to the letter. If there's any deviation, I'll be reporting it to Judge Wallace directly. The mention of Judge Wallace caused a flicker of hesitation in Santos's eyes. But it wasn't enough to fully disarm his suspicion. Let's see those credentials again, he demanded, extending his hand. Before Jackson could respond, a commotion erupted in the holding area. Elizabeth had risen from her seat and was shouting, her voice piercing through the tension. That's him. I recognize that voice. He's the one who killed Mrs. Foster. The observation area descended into chaos. Guards rushed toward Elizabeth's cell, while the executioner froze, his body stiffening as the accusation hung in the air. Jackson seized the moment, stepping closer to the man. You've been caught, Jackson said, his voice low and dangerous. If you want any chance of leniency, you'll start talking now. The executioner turned his head slightly, his hood still obscuring his face. "You're making a mistake," he growled. "I'm just doing my job." "No," Jackson countered, his tone sharp. "You're covering up murder. And Elizabeth isn't your first victim, is she? How many others have you silenced under the guise of standard procedure?" The executioner's silence spoke volumes, his hands tightening into fists. Behind them, Santos barked orders to the guards, his voice rising above the chaos. "Lock this place down. No one leaves until we get this sorted." Florence's voice crackled urgently in Jackson's ear. "Jackson, they're scrambling the cameras. You need to act now." Jackson stepped closer to the executioner, his voice a harsh whisper. "This is your last chance. Tell me everything, or I'll make sure you're the one strapped into that chair by the end of the day." The executioner's shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of his crimes pressing down on him. "It wasn't my idea," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "Victoria Foster paid me to switch the medications. She wanted the nurse out of the way. Judge Wallace made sure it all went smoothly." Jackson's heart raced as the confession spilled out. "And Santos? What's his role in all this?" The executioner hesitated before replying. "He's the fixer. Makes sure evidence disappears. Keeps the guards in line. We've done this before. Mrs. Foster wasn't the first." Behind them, Santos's voice grew louder as he realized the situation was spiraling out of control. Jackson knew his time was up. He grabbed the executioner by the arm, pulling him toward the glass that separated them from Elizabeth. "You're going to repeat everything you just said?" Jackson demanded, loud enough for her to hear. The executioner resisted for a moment before relenting. He raised his voice, his confession echoing through the room. "Elizabeth Parker didn't kill Mrs. Foster. Victoria Foster orchestrated the whole thing. I was paid to switch the medications. And Santos covered it up." Elizabeth's face lit with a flicker of hope, tears streaming down her cheeks as she clung to the words she'd been waiting to hear. The room erupted into chaos once more, but Jackson didn't wait to see the aftermath. He pressed his earpiece, his voice firm. "Florence, call the feds. We've got everything we need." As sirens blared in the distance, Jackson allowed himself a brief moment of relief. They had the truth. Now, they just needed to ensure it was heard. The sirens grew louder, echoing through the walls of Charleston Correctional Facility as federal agents descended on the prison. Jackson stood firm in the execution chamber, his heart racing but his resolve unwavering. The executioner's confession had set the wheels of justice in motion. But he knew this was only the beginning. The web of corruption they were facing extended far beyond these walls. Santos's face was a mask of fury as he barked orders to the guards, attempting to regain control of the spiraling situation. "Secure the facility. Nobody leaves until I give the word." Jackson stepped forward, his voice cutting through the chaos. "It's over, Santos. The feds are on their way. And we've got the confession. You can't cover this up anymore." Santos's hand hovered near his holster, his eyes darting between Jackson and the guards who looked to him for direction. For a moment, it seemed as though he might draw his weapon, but the sound of approaching footsteps down the corridor stopped him. The federal agents had arrived, their authoritative voices echoing in the tense atmosphere. "Step away from the prisoner," one agent commanded, leveling a steady gaze at Santos. "We're taking over." Santos hesitated, his jaw tightening before he reluctantly stepped back, raising his hands in a show of compliance. The guards, sensing the shift in power, followed suit. Jackson let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding as the agents moved in, securing the area. In the holding cell, Elizabeth watched the scene unfold with a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. The heavy burden of despair that had weighed on her for months began to lift as she realized that justice might finally be within reach. She clung to the bars, her voice trembling as she called out, "Please, don't let them take this away. I didn't kill Mrs. Foster. I swear." Jackson turned to her, his expression softening. Elizabeth, you're not alone anymore. We're going to make this right. The agents moved swiftly, taking the executioner into custody. His hood had been removed, revealing a pale, sweat-soaked face that no longer held the authority he had exuded moments earlier. He kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone as he was led away in handcuffs. One of the agents approached Jackson, a clipboard in hand. Detective Weston, you're going to need to give a full statement. We'll also need access to all the evidence you've gathered. Jackson nodded, gesturing to the small recorder in his pocket. I've got it all right here, his confession. The details about the conspiracy. Everything. But there's more. Judge Wallace and Victoria Foster are at the center of this. We need to act fast before they cover their tracks. The agent's expression hardened. We've already issued warrants. They won't get far. As the federal team secured the execution chamber, Jackson turned his attention back to Elizabeth. A guard opened her cell, and for the first time in months, she stepped out into the open air of freedom. Her legs were unsteady, but her spirit was beginning to steady itself. I thought this day would never come, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jackson gave her a reassuring smile. It's not over yet. But we've taken a big step. You're going to get your life back. Elizabeth. Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. But this time, they weren't tears of despair. Thank you, she said, her voice breaking, for believing in me when no one else would. Before they could exchange another word, Florence's voice came through Jackson's earpiece. Jackson, we've got a problem. Santos slipped out during the chaos. He's on the move. Jackson's expression darkened. Where's he headed? From the surveillance feed. It looks like he's making a run for the mansion. If I had to guess, he's going to warn Victoria and Wallace. Jackson clenched his jaw. We can't let him get away. Florence, can you track him? I'm already on it, she replied. He's driving an unmarked car, but I've hacked into traffic cameras. He's taking the back roads, probably trying to avoid detection. Turning to the lead agent, Jackson relayed the information. Santos is on the run. If he gets to Victoria Foster or Judge Wallace, they'll have time to destroy evidence or go underground. We need to intercept him. The agent nodded, immediately issuing orders into his radio. All units, be on the lookout for an unmarked grey sedan. Suspect is armed and dangerous. Jackson glanced at Elizabeth. You'll be safe here with the agents. Stay strong. Okay. Elizabeth nodded, her expression resolute. Go. Do what you need to do. As Jackson and the agents left the prison, a wave of determination washed over him. They had come too far and uncovered too much to let Santos slip through their fingers. The stakes had never been higher, not just for Elizabeth, but for every victim of the conspiracy. The chase was on. Florence's voice guided them through the city streets, her expertise in surveillance proving invaluable. He's heading toward the mansion. I've already alerted a nearby unit. But you're closer. You might be able to intercept him before he gets there. Jackson gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white as he sped through the narrow roads leading to the Foster estate. The mansion loomed in the distance, its silhouette a stark reminder of the power and corruption that had nearly claimed an innocent life. As they approached the estate, Jackson spotted the grey sedan pulling into the driveway. Santos was already out of the car, running toward the side entrance. Without hesitation, Jackson parked abruptly and jumped out, chasing after him. Santos, stop, he shouted, his voice cutting through the stillness of the estate grounds. Santos turned, his face a mask of desperation and fury. He drew his weapon, aiming it at Jackson. You should have stayed out of this. Weston, you don't know who you're messing with. Jackson didn't flinch, his training kicking in. Drop the gun. Santos. It's over. We've got everything, your confession. The evidence tying you to the murders. All of it. There's no escape. Santos's hand trembled, the weight of his actions finally catching up to him. For a moment, it seemed as though he might surrender. Then, with a guttural growl, he turned and ran toward the mansion. Jackson bolted after him, adrenaline surging through his veins. He couldn't let Santos reach Victoria or Wallace, not when they were so close to dismantling the entire operation. As the chase continued, Jackson knew that the next few moments would determine everything. Santos sprinted through the Foster mansion's side entrance, his footsteps echoing in the marble-floored hallways. Jackson followed close behind, his pulse racing. The grandeur of the mansion contrasted sharply with the desperate chase playing out within its walls. Paintings of long-deceased Fosters seemed to watch the pursuit with frozen indifference as Jackson rounded a corner, his eyes fixed on Santos's retreating figure. "Stop, Santos!" Jackson bellowed, his voice reverberating through the cavernous space. But Santos didn't stop. He dashed up a grand staircase, his hand gripping the railing as he pulled himself upward with frenzied energy. Jackson's instincts told him Santos was heading toward the private study, Victoria Foster's sanctuary, and likely the heart of their operation. The chase brought them to the upper level, where Santos burst through a set of double doors into the study. The room was just as opulent as Jackson had imagined, shelves lined with leather-bound books, a polished mahogany desk, and a wall adorned with portraits of Foster ancestors. Victoria Foster stood behind the desk, her sharp, calculating eyes narrowing as she registered Santos's presence and the man pursuing him. "What are you doing here?" Victoria hissed, her voice cold and sharp like broken glass. "You were supposed to keep everything contained." Santos was panting, his face flushed with exertion. "They know, Victoria. They've got the confession. And they're coming for you and Wallace. We need to get out of here now." Jackson stepped into the room, his gun drawn. "No one's going anywhere." Victoria's expression didn't falter. She glanced at Santos, then at Jackson, her mind clearly racing. "Detective Weston, I assume," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. "You've been quite the thorn in my side." Jackson didn't lower his weapon. "It's over, Victoria." Santos confessed. The executioner confessed. "And we've got everything we need to bring you down. Surrender now, or this gets worse for you." But Victoria only laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "Do you think this ends with me, Detective? You're naive if you believe taking me down will dismantle the network. There are more powerful people than me protecting this operation, people who won't hesitate to eliminate you." "You mean Judge Wallace?" Jackson shot back. "His next. But for now, it's your turn." Victoria's eyes darkened, her icy composure cracking slightly. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Santos, clearly less composed, drew his weapon again, aiming it at Jackson. "Drop your gun, Weston, or I swear I'll." The sound of sirens outside the mansion interrupted him. The flashing red and blue lights cast eerie shadows through the large windows, signaling that reinforcements had arrived. Jackson seized the moment, stepping forward with his weapon still trained on Santos. "You won't make it out of this alive, Santos," Jackson said, his voice steady. "Drop the gun, or those federal agents outside will take you down without a second thought." Santos hesitated, his hand trembling as he glanced at Victoria. Her cold stare offered him no support, only a silent expectation that he would handle the situation. With a guttural growl, Santos lowered his weapon, the weight of his betrayal evident on his face. Jackson didn't relax. "On the ground. Now." Santos complied, dropping to his knees and placing his hands behind his head. Jackson moved quickly, securing him with handcuffs while keeping an eye on Victoria. "Your turn," Jackson said, directing his attention to the matriarch. "Hands where I can see them." Victoria raised her hands slowly, a smug smirk playing on her lips. "You may have Santos, Detective, but you'll never have me. Do you think someone like me ends up in a cell? I'll walk free within a week." Jackson stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. We'll see about that. The federal agents entered moments later, their presence filling the room with an air of authority. They moved swiftly, taking custody of Santos and Victoria. She didn't resist, her expression composed, though her knuckles whitened as they placed her in handcuffs. The fall of someone so used to wielding power was a moment Jackson wouldn't forget. As the agents led them out, Florence's voice crackled in Jackson's earpiece. Jackson, I've intercepted communications from Judge Wallace's office. He's trying to flee. We have to move now. Jackson's jaw tightened. Where's he headed? Private airstrip. 10 miles south of town. Florence replied. If we hurry, we can intercept him before he gets on a plane. Jackson left the agents to handle Victoria and Santos, rushing down the mansion's stairs and out into the night. Florence was waiting in the surveillance van, her face set with determination. Let's end this, she said as Jackson climbed into the passenger seat. The van sped through the darkened streets, the urgency of the mission crackling like electricity between them. They both knew this was their final chance to bring Wallace to justice. If he escaped, the network would remain intact, and Elizabeth's fight for justice would be far from over. As they approached the airstrip, Jackson spotted Wallace's sleek black car parked near a waiting jet. The judge stood by the car, speaking animatedly into his phone. Jackson's grip on the door handle tightened. Ready? Florence asked, her eyes flicking toward him. Let's do this, Jackson replied, pushing the door open and stepping out. He didn't need a weapon this time, his conviction was enough. The confrontation was imminent, and Jackson wasn't going to let Wallace slip away. The fight for justice had reached its climax, and there was no turning back now. The private airstrip was eerily quiet, save for the hum of the jet engine in the distance. The sleek aircraft loomed like a shadowy specter on the tarmac, its lights piercing through the dimness. Judge Wallace stood beside his car, the glow of his phone illuminating his face as he barked orders into the receiver. You listen to me, he growled. I don't care what it takes. Clean up this mess, and make sure none of this can be tied back to me. Jackson moved stealthily, keeping his footsteps silent on the gravel. Florence remained in the van, monitoring the situation through her laptop. Her voice came through Jackson's earpiece, tense but focused. He's alone, but the jet crew looks ready to leave. If he gets on that plane, he's gone. I'm not letting him escape, Jackson whispered, his gaze locked on Wallace. The judge's power and arrogance had been the keystone of the conspiracy, and Jackson couldn't allow him to vanish into the shadows. Wallace ended his call and turned toward the jet, his posture rigid, his movements swift. Jackson stepped into the floodlight's glow, his voice cutting through the silence. Going somewhere, Wallace? The judge froze mid-step, his body stiffening. Slowly, he turned, his expression a mix of shock and irritation. Detective Weston, I should have known you'd be a thorn in my side until the end. Jackson advanced, his stance unyielding. This is the end, Wallace. Santos confessed. Victoria's in custody. The whole operation is unraveling, and you're at the center of it. There's nowhere left for you to run. Wallace's lips curled into a sneer. You think you've won? You're a fool, Weston. Men like me don't fall because of a little turbulence. I have connections, power, things you couldn't begin to understand. Jackson stopped a few feet away, his eyes narrowing. Your power won't mean much when you're behind bars. And don't think for a second that your connections can save you now. The feds are on their way. Wallace chuckled, a hollow sound that betrayed his growing unease. You underestimate what I'm capable of. No, I think you've underestimated me, Jackson replied, his voice steady. And Elizabeth Walker. She survived everything you threw at her. You thought you could destroy her, but she's stronger than you'll ever be. For a brief moment, Wallace's facade cracked, a flicker of fear crossing his face. Then, In a desperate move, he reached into his jacket. Jackson's reflexes were faster. His hand shot out, grabbing Wallace's wrist and twisting it, forcing the phone he was reaching for to drop to the ground. "You're not making another call," Jackson said, his tone cold. Wallace struggled, his face contorted in anger. "You don't know what you're doing, Weston. I can end your career, your life." Jackson shoved him against the car, pinning him there. "You've already tried. And look where it's gotten you." The sound of approaching sirens filled the air, the red and blue lights reflecting off the jet's glossy surface. Wallace's bravado faltered as he realized his time had run out. "This isn't over," Wallace hissed, his voice low and venomous. "Oh, it's over," Jackson said, stepping back as federal agents poured onto the scene. "For you, at least." The agents moved in quickly, securing Wallace in handcuffs. He didn't resist, his shoulders slumping as the weight of his defeat settled over him. As they led him away, he cast one last, venomous glance at Jackson. "You'll regret this." Wallace spat. "You have no idea the forces you've unleashed." Jackson didn't flinch. "The only thing I'll regret is not stopping you sooner." As the agents took Wallace into custody, Florence joined Jackson on the tarmac, her face lit with a mixture of relief and triumph. "We did it," she said, her voice soft but filled with pride. Jackson nodded, his gaze lingering on the judge as he was loaded into a waiting federal vehicle. "Yeah, we did." But there was no time to celebrate. They still needed to ensure that the evidence they'd gathered was presented clearly and conclusively. Elizabeth's freedom and the justice owed to Mrs. Margarita Foster and the other victims depended on it. The drive back to the city was quiet, the gravity of their victory tempered by the knowledge of the long road ahead. Florence broke the silence, her voice thoughtful. "You know, Jackson, this case, it's not just about Elizabeth. It's about changing the system, making sure something like this doesn't happen again." Jackson glanced at her, a faint smile playing on his lips. "You're right. And it starts with holding people like Wallace accountable." When they arrived at the federal building, Elizabeth was waiting, flanked by agents who had shielded her from further harm. Her eyes met Jackson's, gratitude and hope shining through the weariness. She stepped forward, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you," she said, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I don't even know how to begin to repay you." Jackson shook his head. "You don't owe me anything, Elizabeth. You deserve justice. And we're going to make sure you get it." Florence stepped in, her tone brisk but warm. "The evidence we have is more than enough. Wallace and his network are done for. Now it's about making sure your name is cleared." Elizabeth's lips quivered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just want to go home." Jackson placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You will. And when you do, you'll finally be able to live without this shadow hanging over you." The three of them stood there for a moment, united by a shared determination. The battle for justice wasn't over, but the tide had turned. Together, they would see it through to the end. The courtroom was silent, the air heavy with anticipation as Elizabeth Walker took the stand. The journey to this moment had been long and arduous, marked by betrayal, pain, and resilience. As she adjusted the microphone, her hands trembled slightly, but her voice, when she spoke, was steady and resolute. "For months, I lived in fear," she began, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the jury. "I was accused of a crime I didn't commit, locked away, and treated like I was less than human. But the truth has a way of finding its light, no matter how deep someone tries to bury it." The room hung on her every word. The presence of Vivian Foster, now the defendant, cast a shadow over the proceedings. Dressed in an orange jumpsuit, her once haughty demeanor was replaced with a quiet, simmering rage. Across from her sat Judge Wallace, his reputation in tatters, his expression blank but his shame undeniable. Santos and Dr. Miguel Sanchez, also in custody, avoided Elizabeth's gaze altogether. Elizabeth continued, her voice gaining strength. Mrs. Margarita Foster was not just my patient, she was my friend. She trusted me, confided in me, and relied on me. To see her life stolen and her name sullied in the pursuit of greed, it broke something in me. But it also gave me purpose. Jackson Wallace watched from the gallery, his arms crossed, his face stoic but proud. Florence sat beside him, her laptop open, ready to provide any supporting evidence as needed. The months of tireless investigation had culminated in this moment. The mountains of evidence they had gathered, the falsified wills, the bank transfers, the corrupt connections, were undeniable. Now, it was Elizabeth's voice that carried the final weight. She recounted every detail of the night Mrs. Margarita died. Her memories vivid and haunting. She spoke of the mysterious man's voice in the hallway, the tampered medications, and the pervasive scent of cologne that lingered in the air. Each word painted a picture of betrayal and calculated cruelty. When Elizabeth paused, the prosecutor, a sharp but fair-minded woman named Catherine Ellis, approached the stand. Ms. Walker, can you tell the court what gave you the strength to keep fighting, even when all hope seemed lost? Elizabeth's eyes softened, and she glanced briefly at Jackson and Florence before answering. It was the people who believed in me. Jackson Wallace, who risked everything to uncover the truth. Florence, who never stopped working to expose the corruption. And most of all, Mrs. Margarita herself. She deserved justice. And I wasn't going to stop until she had it. As Catherine Ellis nodded and returned to her seat, the defense attorney, an older man with a shrewd expression, rose to cross-examine. His voice was measured, his approach calculated. Ms. Walker, you've been through a harrowing ordeal. Do you think it's possible that your memories of that night were influenced by the trauma you experienced? Elizabeth met his gaze without flinching. No. I remember it clearly. Trauma doesn't erase the truth, it sharpens it. And I know what I heard, what I smelled, what I saw. The defense attorney hesitated, sensing the strength in her conviction. He tried a different angle. But isn't it true that you were the sole caregiver in the room that night? How can we be certain you didn't? Catherine Ellis shot up from her seat. Objection. Your Honor, this line of questioning has already been addressed. Ms. Walker was framed, and we have the evidence to prove it. The judge, a younger man known for his impartiality, nodded. Sustained. Move on. Counselor. The defense attorney retreated, visibly frustrated, and Elizabeth stepped down from the stand. As she returned to her seat, Jackson caught her eye and gave her a subtle nod. She nodded back, her heart lighter than it had been in months. The trial continued for weeks, with witness after witness revealing the depth of the conspiracy. Castro, the prison executioner, delivered a reluctant but damning testimony, confirming Vivian's role in orchestrating the plot. Bankers detailed the suspicious transfers, while forensic analysts laid bare the forged documents. Every piece of evidence wove a tapestry of greed and deceit. When Vivian Foster was finally called to the stand, the room was tense. Her arrogance was gone, replaced by a defensive hostility. This is all a misunderstanding, she insisted, her voice trembling. I never intended for any of this to happen. Catherine Ellis approached her with a stack of documents. Mrs. Foster, these are your financial records, showing transactions that directly tie you to the payments made to Santos, Dr. Sanchez, and Judge Wallace. Can you explain them? Vivian faltered, her carefully constructed lies crumbling under the weight of evidence. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she stammered. It was supposed to be simple. Just a way to secure my inheritance, nothing more. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and the judge called for silence. Catherine pressed on. And securing your inheritance required the murder of your own mother. Vivian's face crumpled, her bravado finally breaking. She was going to leave everything to that nurse, she shouted, pointing at Elizabeth. I had no choice. Catherine turned to the jury, her expression somber. You've heard it from her own lips. The greed. The manipulation. The utter disregard for human life. This is the true face of the conspiracy. As the trial drew to a close, the jury deliberated for only a few hours. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. Vivian Foster, Judge Wallace, Santos, and Dr. Miguel Sanchez were all sentenced to life in prison, with Vivian facing additional charges that could lead to the death penalty. Justice, at long last, was served. Elizabeth wept as the judge officially cleared her name, granting her freedom and a substantial compensation for the injustice she had endured. She turned to Jackson and Florence, her heart full of gratitude. I couldn't have done this without you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Jackson smiled, his expression soft. You deserved justice, Elizabeth. And now you have it. Outside the courthouse, the sun shone brightly, a symbol of the hope and healing that lay ahead. Elizabeth inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of her past lift with each breath. Her fight was over, but her purpose was just beginning. Elizabeth stood outside the courthouse, the warm sun shining on her face as if to remind her that life, despite its trials, still held hope. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she breathed deeply, unburdened by fear or injustice. Justice had been served, and those who conspired against her would never harm another soul. She turned to Jackson and Florence, the two people who had believed in her when no one else did. Thank you, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. You gave me back my life. Jackson smiled. It was never about just saving you, Elizabeth. It was about standing up for what's right. And you did that too. Months later, Elizabeth opened the doors to Guardian Angels, a sanctuary for elderly care, vowing to protect those who could not protect themselves. Her story became a beacon of hope, a reminder that truth and resilience could overcome even the darkest schemes. As Jackson returned to his work protecting the vulnerable, and Florence pursued her new path, their shared journey left an indelible mark on their lives. If Elizabeth's story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more tales of hope, courage, and resilience. See you in the next chapter of life.